So this will be a little different for me. Recently, I received an email request to look at a short, one-man developed horror game, and while I don't have too much to say about it individually, it did give me an idea. See, there's quite a few horror games that I don't have a lot to say about on their own, but nonetheless interest me, were requested for me to look at, so on. And I figured, what the hell? Let's just mix and match them all together and make a grab bag episode of indie horror games. So, without further delay, let's get into it. Kiyo's Adventure is one of those RPG maker horror games, a trend which was pretty popular for a while there in the early 2010s. Games like Eve, Mad Father, The Crooked Man, Yume Nikki, all of those. And for the most part, Kiyo's Adventure has a lot of the tropes which made up the prior mentioned games. Instant kill death scenes for failing puzzles or hitting specific tiles, top-down sprite work, an occasionally awful translation job, the works. Kiyo's Adventure mixes these elements with the basic gameplay of Resident Evil, with item boxes, a limited inventory, ammo management, and item-based puzzles used as progression blockers. The game overall is mostly just generic and rather boring, doing nothing particularly well and a few things pretty poorly, mostly stemming from the gacha kills common in RPG Maker horror games. However, what does make Kiyo's Adventure noteworthy, in the most unfortunate sense of the word, is how absolutely gross the game can be. Seeing a pair of panties used as a save point early on was a sign of the experience that was to come. You know, one of those games, but it quickly went from eye-rolling to stomach-turning after that. One of the first things you see is a sprite-work naked anime girl, who's supposed to be a high school student by the way, getting beheaded by guillotine. In the room next to that, you see another one get split in half by a table saw. And believe me when I say that's just the beginning. From overly graphic game over screens showing off the main character's underwear to a side venture where she gets drugged and held captive by a neckbeard with some very bad intentions, the game just feels gross and shocking for its own sake. Kiyo's Adventure is mediocre and only worthy of note because of how tasteless this piece of crap ends up being. Strongly recommended you avoid this one. Moving on to something good, I'll come forward and say that They Breathe is easily my favorite of the games covered today. To the point where I'll refrain from showing or talking too much about it for the sake of the player being surprised. The first thing I noticed about They Breathe was the game's excellent use of tutorial. Outside of the written warning at the title screen that the spacebar is how you dash, the game gives you enough time to play around and understand how the systems in place work. They Breathe is a simple game, no doubt, with only 3 real mechanics in place you have to worry about, but the key to the game's success is how well it utilizes the mechanics it does have. The game doesn't overstay its welcome at all, and manages to use its features to their full extent within its short time frame. And the horror aspect of the game is one of the strongest features. They Breathe's core monster type has a very unsettling design, and when the encounters are paired with the game's eerie, droning soundtrack in the background, I'd be lying if I said the game didn't get a little under my skin at times. It's about $1 and will take you less than 30 minutes to complete, so there's no reason to not give this one a shot. Highly recommend it. And now, we'll touch on the game which sparked this video idea in the first place. I was given a review code from the developer, so for honesty's sake, this is something of a sponsored segment. Fragmented Mind is a first-person horror game, lacking any combat, and can generously be described as a haunted house simulator, similar to games like Layers of Fear or Home Sweet Home. Because it was a request from a first-time developer, and because I don't like harshly reviewing a one-man show, we'll go forward with this one more with a list of recommendations. If I'm being honest, the game doesn't do much to set itself apart from the competition. It's another first-person horror game, and for a first-time job it has some relatively impressive use of things like space manipulation tricks, the good old-fashioned look one way, turn around, the layout has changed. Overall, it's not exactly anything special. The storytelling is on the nose and not well handled, throwing in grim subject matter in a really ham-fisted way. If I had any advice for making a game going forward, assuming that the developer's watching, I'd say these are my tips. First off, I'd recommend you not charge money for this game. If anything, Fragmented Mind feels like a free itch.io game experiment rather than something worth real money. I left the game idle for a while, and I got stuck during one of the pixel hunt puzzles, and it still only took me about half an hour to complete. Releasing a catalog of free experimental games could also work as a resume builder, but at the moment I don't think this is worth money. Another thing is that I'd recommend you make something a little more simple next time. Exploring maybe one core gameplay mechanic that you enjoy or want to see fleshed out. The theming, art direction, story, all of that can be put on the back burner for later projects while you refine your game design skills for game mechanics themselves. Also, for the next game, I'd recommend scaling back a bit. A full haunted house simulator is pretty ambitious for a one-man band, but for early games, try making maybe a haunted room simulator. Think of something like the Cube Escape series, which takes place within a 4-wall environment, yet uses those 4 walls to their absolute limit. Something a bit more reined in like that might give you some limits to work around creatively, while also keeping the scope of the project from escaping your grasp. Anyway, that was my 2 cents on the matter, but speaking of a horror game that takes place within a single room, September 1999 is a free first-person walking sim horror game that was released in 2018. Right off the bat, it has a fairly interesting concept that got my attention initially. The game is essentially a found footage horror game, with a hard time limit of 5 minutes 30 seconds before it ends on its own. It takes place entirely within a room and foyer, and lets you just walk around and observe everything. The gist seems to be piecing together events over the course of a few days and coming up with your own interpretation as to what happened. The game itself is dirt simple, as you can only walk without being able to manually interact with anything. I'd usually be more critical of something like this, but yeah, it's completely free, who cares? And good thing it's free, because while I do like the idea of September 1999, I have to admit the game seems too bare bones overall and is too in love with its own premise. The short runtime encourages multiple playthroughs to observe every detail, but the small environment doesn't really have enough to justify more than one. Even within the 5.5 minutes given, I'd wager most players will see everything of note and be able to come to a conclusion on what the game is about. I'll give credit where credit is due. For as small as it is, the game does make great use of the room and a half it takes place in, and a fair bit of visual imagery is in there that could have some sort of meaning. Like, there's a lot of bird and crucifix imagery that I wasn't really able to piece together. So, could it mean something? I don't know. Like I said, this is only a quick look, but if nothing else, I'm interested to see if the developer wants to take this and expand onto it into a full-on horror game. Could very well be interesting. And we come to the end of this collection by looking at Real Stories from the Grave Episode 1. This was a game made for a PS1 Horror Game Jam, a contest which produces a full list of games that could make up a video like this in the future. Right off the bat, the game is short and sweet, not at all overstaying its welcome, but like the other games we've talked about, lacks a lot of game for this video game. Instead, Real Stories from the Grave Episode 1 focuses on being a solid atmosphere piece, and in that department, it completely succeeds. The black and white low poly, mixed with the distressing setup of disposing of a corpse without any context given to the situation, is good stuff. With how simple the game is, the only real issue I have with it is how, because of that low poly monochrome, it can actually be a little difficult to see things in the environment you're supposed to interact with. I won't spoil the ending here, but I'll just leave it at how this is a nice little horror story with an interesting conclusion and execution. If nothing else, I'm interested to see where these games go from here. I know there's an episode 2 to Real Stories from the Grave out now, which might be worth looking at if we do another one of these horror game roundups in the future.